We saw throughout COVID the apparent inability for well-meaning, very intelligent, experienced researchers and clinicians being unable to communicate their ideas. A lot of people that go into research are not necessarily there to communicate.
Researchers typically are not trained in communication. And what this means is that you're not media trained, so you don't understand how to provide a good soundbite, for example. But as we saw during the COVID pandemic, there is a need for scientists and engineers to learn how to communicate better with the general public in order to raise the confidence of the general public in science.
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
Welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. I'm your AI host, Mark Verbankov's deepfake avatar, and this is episode 207. Why do brilliant researchers often struggle to explain their ideas to the public or investors? This episode tackles the communication gap in science and technology, and how the belief that simplifying ideas means dumbing them down can damage public trust in everything from vaccines to climate science. We discuss why clear communication is now essential for securing grants, attracting venture capital, and commercializing innovation. Beyond communication, the episode explores the future of personalized healthcare, from at-home diagnostic tools to truly personalized electronic health records that can be securely shared with medical teams. Despite ongoing challenges in data privacy and regulation, the rise of decentralized clinical trials and telemedicine is driving a major shift in how we monitor and manage our health. Finally, we look to the skies for medical innovation, uncovering how space technology is shaping healthcare. The need for reliable, autonomous medical tools on long-duration missions is fueling breakthroughs that could soon benefit rural and underserved communities here on Earth, proving that the benefits of exploration often have profound, grounded impacts. Our guest today, Elizabeth Chabi, is an expert in science marketing with deep experience bridging academia and industry. She has worked with research universities, national labs, and technology transfer offices to help researchers successfully commercialize their technologies and form public-private academic partnerships. Elizabeth now collaborates with major life sciences and diagnostics companies, offering data-driven marketing strategies for complex product launches. She is the founder of High Touch Group, HTG, an agency delivering end-to-end marketing services for life sciences, diagnostics, and engineering firms.
All right, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Yeah, so we're going to get into quite a bit in this episode today, but just as I start with most episodes, how did you get involved in the work that you're doing? Was there some kind of event, or was there just a unique moment, or was it just kind of a natural, organic flow into the work that you're doing?
I think that there are two sort of inflection points that happened at the same time. So I began my career running research programs at academic labs, funded primarily by the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and several Department of Defense organizations. But the way I got there was I had started a lot of companies as a young kid primarily, and started relatively early. So I was a little bit precocious, and I was at a talk that a lab director was giving, and I went up to him after the talk with all of these ideas as a 21-year-old or something would, without much filter and without much understanding of the environment. But he saw something in that ambition, hired me, and kind of my career took off in that direction from there. But the particular talk that I saw was around floating offshore wind, which is a type of platform that we don't have a lot of in the United States, but you see more of in Europe and in other places in the world. But at the time, there was only one in the world. And so this technology was very new, and it had the potential to really revolutionize energy generation in the United States. And I was very interested in climate change and climate technology. And so that's really what inspired me to get involved in the sciences, first managing R&D programs, and then now as a consultant to larger organizations.
Interesting. So you clearly work with a lot of different type of companies in a number of industries. Again, personally, do you have maybe you don't want to answer this, but do you have like a personal specific interest in a type of industry or a type of innovation or technology that you like to work on more than others? I know that everything's interesting, but anything personally for you?
Everything is interesting. I think you probably do the show because you have a lot of different interests, right? But I have two very specific ones these days. One is diagnostics, so medical diagnostics primarily, and how can we evolve that technology to be in the home where patients can be monitoring their health data at home, and wellness data as well at a level that right now consumer technologies just don't do, as well as integrate with electronic health records and really put patients in more control of their health and their health data, and of course, long term health outcomes. And then the second area that I'm very interested in these days is this overlap between space technology and healthcare or medicine. This is increasingly important as we have in more manned space missions, as people start planning longer stays on space stations, as governments are increasingly developing space policy that will inform future Mars and lunar missions and potentially space colonization. I know that sounds kind of sci-fi, but this is a focused podcast. So that's a real passion of mine lately, and where we're seeing a lot of interest in consulting work.
Right. Um, with this, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the kind of umbrella term for what your first point is like personalized healthcare, right? It's the ability to, rather than have this general healthcare, you go to the doctor and it's like, okay, follow these kind of protocols that generally apply to people. You have a very specific protocol that can be applied to you as an individual, right? Later on, it'll be like, genetic testing and really identifying every specific thing for you. I've had a number of guests on the podcast over the last couple of years that talk about this. Is there one, or is there a couple like things that you are finding more interesting than others in this development of this emerging technology? Because I think it's fascinating. Um, and also like I want it to be here now so that, we can all get healthier and have, longer lifespans and all this kind of stuff. But are there certain things that you find a little bit more interesting or a little bit more, I don't know, even crazy as you're dealing with a lot of your clients?
Yeah, I think that there are some crazy technologies out there, but one of the ones that I think is maybe less crazy is this idea that electronic health records, especially in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world, are kind of a mess. It can be very expensive to see a specialist. It can be very expensive to have specialized diagnostics run in clinical settings. And then it becomes even more expensive if there's no record of that test. And so your primary care physician or your specialists, if they don't have access to all of that data, it's really kind of all for naught. And the patient ends up bearing the cost burden. And so I think one of the really interesting and useful parts of these at-home diagnostic technologies that hopefully will be on the market soon is the potential to collect all of this information into a personalized electronic health record that can be shared with your doctor, with your specialists, with your entire medical team. And what that means is that, an action can be triggered after the fact, right? So maybe there's a prescription, maybe there's a follow-up, maybe there's a change in your care plan, or maybe it's just monitoring and preventative care, but your doctor now has the data to say, hey, you're consistently low on your vitamin D levels or what have you, and even prescribe just a vitamin. And this healthcare stack, I think, is ready for the shift. I think socially and politically, especially in the United States, we're ready for something better than the current healthcare system. And I think that miniaturized chemistry, phone cameras that can read assay results with high fidelity, on device AI that reduces user error, standard health data pipelines that let patients share results securely with their electronic health records. These things all exist. So I'm really out there looking for what's the company that's going to connect all of those dots and be able to commercialize and have first mover advantage.
Right. Yeah, which is, probably next multi-billion, trillion, multi-trillion dollar company, right? That's the exciting part of it as well. Um, so one of the questions that comes up when we're talking about, biotech or life sciences in other episodes is, of course, the um, safety of your private data, right? And I think that this kind of is a segue into kind of what you do, but also in general, like how do these companies communicate the safety of that or of the non-sharing to third parties, right? There's been all of this animosity towards these large companies that they're taking your data, they're selling it to others, and then they're feeding you ads that you don't want to see, but they're specific to you. Um, how do you think that this challenge of communicating that particular thing, not to mention the complexities of the technologies itself and the benefits of the technologies, which I think we can get into maybe next.
Yeah. It's a really great question because obviously this is a concern from a regulatory perspective. The FDA in the United States isn't going to just approve these at-home tests without knowing that data can be shared securely. And of course, the FDA is already reticent to approve tests that patients might get diagnoses at home that might be kind of emotionally devastating and can't today trigger that next action, like a call from your specialist or a follow-up appointment or a prescription. And so I think that there's that problem that needs to be solved. There needs to be a little bit more comfort in patients being able to choose to be diagnosed at home and that being an individual care decision that the patient's allowed to make. And then obviously making sure that there's data security. But with blockchain technologies already providing evidence that we can do this sort of thing securely, with the rise of telemedicine, I think that we're starting to see some of those barriers get reduced. And I'm hopeful that over the next few years, we'll start to see the FDA approve some of these technologies so that they can start to get into consumers' hands. Another interesting point here, though, is that we're starting to see the rise of decentralized clinical trials, both for therapeutics as well as medical devices. What that means, just for people listening who don't know, clinical trials right now today are typically hosted at clinical trial sites, usually research hospitals, for example, or specialized test clinics. And this means that patients with a rare orphan disease, very often, you're not necessarily living in Boston. Very few people might have these diseases. And so it can be difficult to get a statistically relevant sample size for your clinical trials, especially in the rare and orphan disease space, but also in a lot of neurodegenerative diseases, med tech. And so decentralized clinical trials already are providing these pathways for sharing that data securely from different locations. And we're starting to see the rise of those, especially post-COVID, when the options were we do this decentralized or we might have to pause clinical trials for a long time, which can be devastating to health infrastructure. So I think the technology is increasingly getting there. The FDA's comfort level is getting there. And hopefully in the next few years, we'll have some interesting use cases in the market.
Interesting. So, you mentioned like one rare disease could be tested with this decentralized testing. Um, do you have a rough idea as to, like, the timeline when I mean, it's already kind of happened a little bit, but, like, is there a graph of, like, decentralized testing increasing by X amount every single year? I think it's quite an interesting, shift from how things have been done in the past.
I will send you something for the show notes. An organization called the Decentralized Clinical Trials Alliance runs an annual conference and they collect a lot of this data. But essentially, they're designing the best practices for biopharma companies, med tech companies to be able to use in their clinical trials if they want to do them in a decentralized way. And so they've really got the most up to date statistics, but I'll send over a link.
Perfect, perfect. Yeah, I'll definitely try to fill those show notes as much as possible with information for the audience. Great. Um, so following from my previous question, connect a little bit more to I guess the consulting that you do, or the marketing support, the communication support that you do for a lot of your clients. Um, we also saw, not, I don't want to talk about COVID, but we saw throughout COVID the apparent inability for, well-meaning, very intelligent, experienced researchers and clinicians being unable to communicate their ideas. I think that this is shall we say, a stable idea that has been around for a long time, right? A lot of people that go into research are not necessarily there to communicate. Um, what is kind of like one of the, as you've seen it, kind of the biggest mistake that these researchers make when they're trying to communicate their ideas? I'm assuming it's getting too technical, but I'd like to hear from yourself.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure you encounter this fairly often, maybe with your guests, right? Uh, Researchers typically are not trained in communication outside of what you might need in order to write a peer-reviewed journal article or perhaps give a scientific presentation. And what this means is that you're not media trained. So you don't understand how to provide a good sound bites, for example. And often this comes not just from an inability to communicate kind of out of the gate, but it comes from this idea that, if you've been studying this small corner of the world and you're one of the leading experts in this corner of the world, it can feel like you are dumbing down the information in order to communicate more broadly. But as we saw during the COVID pandemic, and as we've seen with climate change, as we've seen with very likely the next pandemic, there is a need for scientists and engineers to learn how to communicate better with the general public in order to raise the confidence of the general public in science. We see right now, and I don't want to get too political, right? Because we see ebbs and flows with every administration, right? But as we see now, we have, anti-vaxxers in charge of vaccine policy in the states, right? And I think that if there was an increased understanding by the general public in how mRNA vaccines work, for example, I think that we would see a little less of that political blowback that can really set our, standard of care back so many years and for many years to come. But besides communicating with the general public and that public service that I think sort of behooves all researchers to communicate with the general public about what they do, I think there's also this other element of, well, what happens when research grants from the federal government dry up and there isn't as much funding to go around? Well, you're going to have to be a much better communicator in order to be a cut above the rest to get those federal grants, number one. And number two, you're likely going to need to either bootstrap longer, which means you need to be a strong communicator for your internal team. And you might have to raise venture capital or capital from other sources earlier than you were planning. And that requires you to be a strong communicator. So I think that it really is important that researchers, no matter their fields, become strong communicators, even if they don't feel like it comes naturally to them. It is a learned skill. They can learn it. So we do a lot of media training for our clients. And it's something that I think is just incredibly important for researchers today.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring up. These kind of like two main domains, whether it's the general public or or I guess the government as well, and then venture capital. Is there a significant difference in how you consult or train your clients to communicate to these two and a half or three different audiences? I think I'd be very interested to hear that.
Absolutely. It takes I'm always on the search for the next Bill Nye, as I call them. So who is that researcher who can get on a stage and not only explain what they do and why it's important in a way that will really stay with the audience, no matter who the audience is, but who is constantly learning how to perform better in those environments. And there aren't many of these researchers who have kind of crossed over into solely public communication, but they exist, and they're amazing. And some of them are coming out of left field. There are some great channels on Twitch, for example, that do live stream kind of lab stories that are really fun to watch. There are some great TikTok influencers in the medical space that do a great job communicating. And so I think that they are out there. But the way that you train to communicate to the general public is a little different than how you train to communicate to an investor audience. An investor audience is going to want to get into the business details of what it is that they're buying, right? And so the talking points are different. The pitch is a little different. But at the end of the day, that sense of performance and eloquence and presence needs to be available in that researcher in both of those scenarios.
Right. Um, and then I'm sure you've seen, the clients that you're helping out succeed, and then the ones that you maybe had some initial discussions with and they didn't work with you. I'm sure that they failed. So is there, I mean, apart from communicating properly, is there something that distinguishes those that succeed and fail, even if both have a really good product or a really good new technology that they're trying to produce and provide?
There are so many good technologies that essentially get shelved or stay on the shelf because they can't be commercialized. And sometimes I think you are a victim of circumstance to a certain extent. Not every technology is going to be fundable from private equity or venture capital, even early stage funds. Some technologies are just too early for a lot of those funds. And if there aren't government programs or private foundations that can support that work, sometimes it's too expensive to bootstrap. And the founder just can't figure out a way to get enough money to move forward. So that can be a problem. But very often, that problem is solved by having a strong communication strategy and by executing that communication strategy. And so, whether that's a combination of media events and well-written grant proposals and pitching various seed funds and so on, there's usually a group of strategies, tactics, and channels that we're recommending for these individual programs, either to get them off the ground or to meet their next milestone. More often these days, our accounts are a little bit larger, so they're a little further along in their commercialization journey. So, for example, they might be positioning for acquisition, they might be looking for a private equity investment. And so these are companies that maybe they've been bootstrapped, maybe they're service providers in the space and they've just kind of grown as their client base has grown. Maybe they've gotten their Series A, their Series B, they've launched a couple of products, or they have a product moving into clinical trials, or their first clinical trials are promising. And so these are all inflection points where we're typically brought in. And the communication strategies, of course, are a little different depending on the stage, the type of account, and so on.
Okay. You also mentioned that so you're supporting companies, helping to understand or coaching them how to communicate for venture funding. You said everybody can learn the skill. How long does that take roughly? I know that everybody's busy. They probably aren't focusing on this 24/7. Is it like a 3-week program, a 3-month program? Like what's kind of the timeline here? It's quite curious.
Yeah, that's also a good question. I don't know if there's a tried and true number of weeks, number of months, but I'll give you a couple of examples just to kind of level set. So if you are an inexperienced founder, an inexperienced communicator, that is the type of accounts that we would probably put into a founder program. So we have this program that we run every quarter where we're essentially coaching earlier stage founders along to basically get their first marketing strategy and marketing assets, coaching them on brand story, on product story, on confident delivery, teaching a few basics of media planning and media strategy and so on. That particular program runs for 6 weeks for us. Does that mean that they leave as communications experts? No, but they're well on their way to being able to pitch and raise at that stage. They practice a pitch deck, for example, whereas very often they haven't presented anything other than novel research data it's past. So getting a researcher to shift in tone from the very technical to the business case can be a little bit daunting for them at first, but that program we've seen some success with. Later stage founders do tend to have larger teams. And so sometimes it's not the CEO who's best positioned to speak on behalf of the company or the founder. Sometimes it's the chief scientific officer. Sometimes it's the business development lead, even, or a chief operating officer. It doesn't need to be the founder or CEO. And sometimes it's really more about understanding the executives in the particular account who can speak on behalf of the company and who are comfortable. Some of them love being on stage, love doing these podcasts, love it being interviewed, and love pitching. And so if you can find that person in an account, that's gold.
Right. Have you ever come across a company that it's so complex or so technical that they can't communicate this?
Hmm. Typically, if it's too complex at the get-go, it means that we have more questions to ask. Uh, Typically, complexity is a shield for not understanding product market fits appropriately, right? As so you kind of obfuscate the business objectives of the product because you're in the technical weeds. Very often, there might be really interesting IP and it might function at the prototype stage. The founder maybe bootstrapped this all the way. But very often, what you find in these initial founder based conversations is they have no idea of product market fit, of who might buy the product, if there even is a market for this product. And if they've been successfully grant funded to a certain stage, very often they think, well, of course there's a market. I've gotten all of this money for the technology historic. Therefore, I just need a brilliant business plan and somebody will give me money. And unfortunately, very often, if you're developing a research tool, reagent kits, some things like this, you may have a really interesting homebrew that solved a problem for your lab, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make a good commercial product or baseline for an entire company. And so, understanding product market fit and having those tough conversations with early founders or founding teams is very, very important because it might be that the initial markets that they think their product is best for isn't what's best for that product, but maybe we can help them find some alternatives. Other times, maybe there isn't an alternative, and that's when we unfortunately have to have those tough decisions, tough conversations.
Right, right. Yeah, I helped a friend about 10 years ago or so, about a decade ago, an engineer, brilliant, and his project was insanely complex, right? And he was always communicating all the different details of it. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm helping you with this pitch. You're going to an investor, a small little venture club of some sort. Like I've been listening to you for a week. I don't even understand what you're doing, right? So that's the reason I asked. It's a personal thing, but I'm sure it happens multiple times, right? People have great ideas. Yeah.
I sit through probably 5 pitches a week where I'm just like,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
this is going to need some work.
Right. Oh, so interesting. Um, and do you see, I guess my question is like the evolution or the growth of these people? Like they go through your program or, maybe they go away and they come back a year later. Are they like, there's improvement in the capacity for them to communicate these ideas clearly? Like it does take time, but it does happen, right? Not
It
for,
does happen, and I think the founders program's been really interesting because the reason we actually started it, just to give you a little bit of background there, the National Science Foundation used to run a program called Communicating Science, and they sold the program or gave the program to AAAS, which is a science association in the United States, who put it behind a paywall. It no longer went to universities. They put it behind a paywall. It's like $700. It's footage from 30 years ago. It's just completely irrelevant to the communications landscape today. And the course has never been redeveloped. I took the course live, 20 years ago, and I know so many researchers who benefited from that program. And so the founders program is sort of based around this idea of, okay, well, we need a replacement for this, but we also need a replacement that meets the standard for communication today. So a real focus on TikTok videos, a real focus on YouTube live streams, and also more of a commercialization focus because that NSF program was really more basics of media training and communicating with the general public around what your science is. So that's why we did that program. And the goal isn't necessarily to take, the 12 founders a quarter and get their technology commercialized, but it's to give them a jumping off point, especially if their academic institutions don't have similar programs through their technology offices, tech transfer offices, and that sort of thing. But so yes, we do see marked improvements in that 6-week program. But our model for the consulting side outside of that program is interesting. We actually only select 12 to 15 accounts to work with each year. Most of them are with us for 3 to 7 years. And so we're with a very focused group of accounts over the long term. And so, yes, of course, we see a lot of growth, whether that's acquisition from private equity, venture capital investments, but also, of course, things like product launches, service launches, their own acquisitions when they're bolting on tech and IP as opposed to developing it in-house. And so a lot of our work is actually focused on those slightly later stage companies with those other inflection points. And we spend a lot of time with those executive teams over several years. And of course, are reporting out, return on that investment a lot.
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course. Oh, okay, super interesting. Um, I want, or I wanted, I guess I still want to ask you about how AI is impacting this and how's it getting involved. But you mentioned a couple times like TikTok, you mentioned Twitch. I think you said YouTube. Could you, to use the phrase, double click on that now? How these platforms are influencing, communication of these, shall we say, innovations, technology, life sciences, space, etc.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure you see it probably in podcast metrics. YouTube and other video platforms are just doing incredibly well. And we're seeing this in the science communication sector as well. So if we can get some great sound bites about your technology on TikTok, if we can build a following on a YouTube channel, we see just marked increase in a couple of things. One, of course, traditional marketing metrics like marketing qualified leads, sales qualified leads. We have more content that we can point to for investors and for others who are interested in the company. It just makes the company feel better established. And it also provides teams with ample opportunity to practice communication skills and so that they can grow them so that when it really matters, like when they're on stage at that very important event or when they're pitching that very important investor, they have a lot of experience communicating, making sure sound bites get through, making sure that they're driving certain points home. And so it is both a channel for, gathering leads, for example, in just a traditional sales and marketing context, of course, but it's also incredibly important for media training and communications literacy with these teams. And so that's sort of our sneaky backdoor way of making sure that they're getting this training and they're continuing to improve over time, as opposed to saying, we did the training and you're now executing the marketing plan, high touch for and we'll let you take it from there. We want to make sure that they're involved in a day-to-day way.
Interesting. Yeah, and I guess with TikTok, for instance, being so broad, like everything's on there. You mentioned there's some influencers on there talking about life sciences, etc. I wouldn't have thought about that before, but I guess it's a perfect platform to as you said, test these things out and improve your skills. Very interesting. So I have to ask the obvious question: how is AI involved in all of this now? It's obviously being used by everybody. Are the pitch decks being put together faster? Are people like learning faster? Maybe narrowing their message down, right? This is something that I do. I've got ChatGPT open every single day on one of my screens, and constantly like refining messages or ideas is certainly, shall we say, hastened compared to before.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things we did about a year and a half ago was we built on top of a large language model. We essentially insourced public journal articles as well as independent. We have a market intelligence team on my team, and I also own a market research organization as well. And all of that independent market research data that we're generating also goes into that LLM. So we use that for our founding teams and for our consulting clients, of course, and all sorts of things, whether it's briefing on competitors, whether it's briefing on specific aspects of the technology, of the IP. We connect into the patents database in the US. So there are all sorts of ways that we use it for research. And that's on the marketing, communications, and business strategy side. We also use it, some of our accounts, we work with them on acquisition planning. So if they're bolting on either IP insourcing or bolting on a new company and using it as a service line, for example, or a new product line, we'll do a lot of the research, initial research anyway, using our tools that we've built on AI. But obviously, within our client accounts, there's a lot of AI use. We produce an event called the Advanced Lateral Flow Conference in October for one of our clients. And at that event on day 2, we're dedicating a good chunk of the event to how AI is being leveraged in lateral flow point of care testing. We actually have the head of science operations from Palantir delivering the keynote on that day to kind of kick us off there. So really, we're seeing it all over the place in our accounts as well as in all the consulting work that we're doing.
Yeah, yeah. From the numerous guests that I've had on, it's just becoming ubiquitous in like the obvious places that you would think, using it personally, but also in just throughout an organization. Very, very interesting stuff. Um, I see. I'm also paying attention to the time here. I see that our time is winding down. Should we look towards the future? What's gonna be happening? Maybe talk a little bit about like how communication, if communication might change, or if it's just kind of a, shall we say, a forever thing that is not going to change. Maybe change my mind on that.
I think that always being able to communicate well is going to be important. The channels may change, the keywords that we inject into our conversations may change. The way we're framing a pitch may change based on market conditions, right? But the foundations of communication are always going to be relevant. And so I think now more than ever, it's very important that science organizations think about how they're communicating about the work that they do and to whom and for what purpose in order to keep their bank accounts full. Because fortunately, science and engineering technology advancement costs a lot of money. It's very expensive, whether we're talking about diagnostics, biotech, and therapeutic developments, or space tech, right? These are all very expensive fields. And so it's very important that these organizations understand that communication is going to be very important. They don't need to be everywhere, of course. We're not saying every organization should be on TikTok, but there's a reason to be for certain types of organizations. And so keeping up with those changing times can be very important. Um, and I think there's also a lot changing kind of in the technology space as well, and sort of what we're going to be communicating about and how we're going to be receiving those communications over the next few years. So that's all interesting too.
Yeah. We mentioned very briefly before the recording how, well, we didn't mention specifically AI, but with the AI's ability to create content at a massive scale compared to before. I think the point is, communication is going to become actually more important because you're going to have to cut through all of this nonsense. Like whether it's nonsense or not, I use an AI avatar to do the pre-introduction for this podcast because it saves me an incredible amount of time, right? All of these podcasts, I have to do, recording every single time. No, just ask the AI avatar to do it. It's not perfect, but it saves time. And I guess the point is there's going to be organization after organization after organization that are going to be use AI avatars or completely generated video that gets their message out there. And, a lot of it's just going to be slop. So learning how to communicate properly and I guess finding your correct audience, your, clients, et cetera, is going to become, I think, even more important as time goes on.
No, I agree with you. And I think we're going to see the death of a lot of marketing agencies, especially that aren't able to do this well and that aren't able to meet the moment with quality content that cuts through the noise. We've seen over the last, 15 years, this idea of funnel-based marketing where you get somebody really interested because of the hook, and then they click through and give you their contact information, and then your inside sales team reaches out to them or what have you, right? Or they're enrolled in a nurture program. I think we're going to see a lot of that go away. And if your agency can't create the kind of high caliber content that your customers, that your investors, and that others that you need to influence policymakers can read or listen to and understand and believe in and trust, then we're going to have you're going to have issues, right?
That's a really, I think, important point, the believe and trusting, again, because of the scale of the slop that's going to be out there. You can already see it on comments on YouTube and these other platforms, even if it's a real video and it's a little bit bizarre, or something that's not ordinary, people are, oh, that's just AI, right? So there's already this Photoshop situation where people see, oh, there's some weird picture. Oh, it's just photoshopped, right? I don't believe it anymore. The same thing now starting to happen with video. And I've had some guests come on and say, it's the start of an era of the death of trust in video. So if we can figure out a way to have the people that we want to reach out to trust whatever we're saying or your clients are saying, I think that's going to be perhaps even more important than anything else. And if you really think about it over the next 5-10 years or so.
Yeah. It's also a great application for blockchain technology. Honestly, having embedded digital watermarks and thumbprints that prove essentially the validity of video versus AI generated content, I think will be important. But it's for years, right, we have photoshopped the images of people, especially women, right, in news media, beauty magazines, and have kind of set these unrealistic standards that society just sort of believes in. And so I would hope that we are going to see other forces prevail and that we'll get tools and technologies that help us better understand when something is AI generated versus not. But there is obviously a lot of money to be made in AI generated content, and those media companies tend to be have pretty deep pockets and be pretty influential. So I think it's important, but I don't think that we should hold our breaths waiting for it.
Yeah, yeah, and also back to one of the points you were talking about earlier with the democratization of testing, you also have the democratization of these tools. So you have, I got about 6 calls yesterday for some scam, from some Indian scam farm. Those people are going to move from telephone scams to AI scams if they're not already doing so. So the amount of these things is just going to go through the roof, and they're probably going to be pretty damn good over the next 10 years too.
Sure, that's true. On the other hand, maybe be less human trafficking running these like scam mills. Maybe it'll be AI and they won't need to. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, there's always a silver lining, right?
maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. So there's about 10 minutes left. We haven't really touched on space tech at all. I'm also fascinated by it, but life sciences is super cool as well. Could you touch on that just very briefly, and then we can kind of end things off from there.
Yeah, sure. So really where I'm involved in space tech is this intersection of medicine and med tech and space tech. So from one perspective, medicine and space is it's a very rugged environment, right? So it's one of the best stress tests that we have for healthcare. So if you can do something in space, believe me, you can do it in a rural environment. It also means that the tools that we're using in space, they have to meet certain environmental requirements that they don't necessarily have to on Earth. Very often, you're not going to be a doctor or a trained medical professional, maybe using a diagnostic test or some sort of medical device. So these tools end up having to be cheaper, simpler to use, and very, very reliable because you likely have one and limited redundancy, if any redundancy. So we're already seeing this in portable molecular analysis, remote guidance for imaging. Space really forces design choices that favor autonomy and clarity, which is exactly what clinics, disaster settings, rural areas all need worldwide as well. So there's kind of this interesting push-pull that's going on in this intersection. How do we get a medicine to work in space and different gravity environments, for example? But also, what does that mean for these medical devices and diagnostics on Earth? And are there applications that can overlap and kind of drive some greater health equity here on this planet?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that a lot of my friends talk about, in the sense that, space exploration is cool and all, and we should be funding it. I think it absolutely should be. But a lot of my friends say, but the real cool thing, or the interesting thing is, well, the benefits that we get from that, right? Like the classic example is, Velcro and the microwave and some of these things that came from the initial space program. I think that, as you're saying, because it's so hard to do in space, if you can get it done there, then the kind of trickle down or flow down effect from the space program to rural places and others is going to be quite positive for the future, I would say.
I think so. I think it'll drive a lot of these at-home molecular tests, CRISPR-based assays, virtual care pathways. I mean, how are we going to get this data from space back to Earth? So really interesting field of research and commercialization right now for some of the early tech.
Yeah, no, super interesting. The future's fascinating. That's one of the reasons I love having this podcast. Elizabeth, before I say thank you, is there any other thing that you would like to share with the audience that you think I've missed? Obviously, haven't put everything in the show notes, but if there's anything that you want to kind of end the podcast on, I'm happy to give you the floor.
Well, as I mentioned, we only work with a handful of founders and a handful of accounts each year for consulting. But I did write a book too, because I'm very passionate about getting more scientists to be better communicators and to raise early funding. So I wrote a book called The Giant's Ladder with the goal of trying to get more people trained, at least in some of these early skills, as much as a book can train anybody. But it is very difficult. I would love to do a little bit more work in improving communication skills of researchers over time, and not just the founder sets that myself and my other strategists can work with. So I'm actively looking for ways to do that. So if there are people in your audience who are kind of thinking along the same lines, please provide my LinkedIn in the show notes, and happy to connect.
Will do. Perfect. Yeah, I'll have your book link, website, LinkedIn, and you can send me over email if there's any other things that you want in there. So, thanks again, Elizabeth. Really, really interesting, and thanks for your time and your insights. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Great.
Well, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel, where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, Please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living the highest standard of living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.